For more on NATO's position on Ukraine and Iraq, we turn to Jorge Benitez. He is the director of NATO-Source and a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. How will Kerry's visit to Iraq impact NATO and, of course, the escalating crisis in that country, would you say?
Well, Secretary Kerry will provide a very brief discussion on his meeting with Maliki and the situation in Iraq. He'll mostly provide information to his other foreign ministers there, but the vast majority of the NATO members want to stay as far away from Iraq as possible. And in fact, the Secretary General Rasmussen has said NATO has no role in Iraq.
And they've got bigger fish to fry and not too far from where they are, Ukraine.
Exactly.
It's a big issue. What do you see them doing on that?
Well, the big news that's going to be coming out of the ministers' meeting tomorrow is regarding Ukraine. The foreign ministers are probably going to agree on what's called a trust fund. They're going to be, some of the NATO members will be providing voluntary funds to help the Ukrainian Defense Ministry. Primarily, this will be in communications, logistics, and maybe even cyber defense.
One of the things I want to ask you is, the U.S., the Obama administration made quite a bit of publicity, brought themselves a great deal of publicity with this pivot to Asia. And then we've seen situations in Syria, Iraq, Egypt, and of course now Ukraine. And ironically, I was reading today that there wasn't even a U.S. tank on European soil earlier at the beginning of this year. Did they kind of miscalculate the possibilities of what might happen politically and of course this explosion of what's going on, of course, in Iraq and Europe, would you say?
I certainly think so. I think Obama's pivot strategy was more of a desire to pivot out of the Middle East rather than to Asia. And in regards to pivoting away from the Middle East, that also included pivoting away some of our resources from Europe.
There is also, NATO appears to be in a bit of a pickle right now as well. Georgia wants a pathway into NATO, and there seems to be this disagreement within NATO. Some don't want to do that because they feel like it might antagonize Russia further, and then others say, no, it's time to take a strong stand against Russia. How's that playing out?
Well, this has been a very difficult issue for the alliance to come up with. And as we're moving forward, we're only about 10 weeks away from the NATO summit where the heads of state are going to gather. So because, as you pointed out, there's so many countries within NATO that have reservations about inviting Georgia to have a map, the map would be a significant step for actually joining the alliance. So it seems unlikely that they'll receive that invitation. But NATO's going to have probably what it calls a reinforced cooperation plan with Georgia to try to give it reassurances and encouragement without giving it the official map.
Interestingly enough, the Estonian prime minister is urging NATO, and I want to get his quote just right, to open your eyes and stay awake. He wants policing for border countries like Estonia, Latvia, and Poland. Again, it seems as though some NATO forces, though, are kind of concerned that that would antagonize Russia further. What about this situation? How's that going to play out?
There's different threat perceptions among the NATO allies, and Russia is one of the most divisive issues. The closer you come to the Russian border, the more the NATO allies want to have a stronger response to Russian policies, particularly their aggression in the Ukraine. The Estonians and other Central European NATO allies want to have a permanent NATO presence in their countries, but the rest of the NATO members aren't willing to go that far. That's one of the reasons why President Obama had his billion-dollar initiative. The U.S. is going to increase its rotational forces in that area, but they won't be permanent.
It's interesting to see what happens. Jorge Benitez, always a pleasure having you in. Thanks so much for stopping by.